Alrighty. First of all, I'm really excited to be talking with all of you this evening. And I wanted to start things off by sharing a little bit about the role that Siena and I play at Grassroots Ecology. So let's click the right thing. There we go. So we are both members of the California Conservation Corps Watershed Stewards program that's in partnership with AmeriCorps. And we are in a cohort of other members that are placed with state, county, nonprofit, and federal organizations all throughout California, where we're all contributing to efforts that strive to protect, conserve, and enhance anadromous watersheds. And this is a really awesome opportunity to gain environmental outreach, education, and leadership skills. And for Siena and I specifically, that means getting to participate with a lot of habitat restoration and water quality monitoring projects, and getting to do a lot of really awesome events where we're getting to, engage with our community like tonight. So I'm really excited to be here. And on top of that, our application for the Watershed Stewards program for next year's term, starting in October, it's 10.5 months. So the 2020 to 2021 term is now open. So if there are any young professionals out there looking to be involved in watershed conservation, then I highly recommend you check out this program. Alrighty. So here we have a few views of some of our local creeks that we have in San Mateo and Santa Clara counties. I'm assuming that right now everyone's taking the time to go outside and get on walks and appreciate and enjoy nature right now. Maybe that means you're getting to walk around your local creek, getting to see, beautiful vegetation, really awesome wildlife. And if you are able to go walk along a creek, maybe you're getting to see what's inside the creek. Maybe there isn't water, so you're wondering, what things are normally living there, what their life cycle's like, what's up with the water that we have in our creeks. Well, that's going to be the focus of our talk today, the fish. And there's lots of other really cool things that are living in those creeks, but we're going to be focusing on the fish today primarily. So let's look at our creeks themselves, because we can't have fish if we don't have water. So here's a graphic that shows a bit like a chunk of our South Bay area creeks. You can see the peaks on the left representing our Santa Cruz Mountains, which is where all of these creeks start out. Their headwaters are in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and they flow out across the land and drain into the San Francisco Bay. And so the land is acting like a drainage basin or watershed that the water is moving and carving through as it ends up into the bay. So we're all a part of the San Francisco Bay watershed, because all of the water of the creeks that we live near, that's their drainage point. But there are also lots of smaller, more local watersheds, which is what everyone was sharing in the chat earlier. So, watersheds like Stevens Creek, San Francisquito, San Mateo, Coyote Creeks, those are all more local watersheds that we belong in and that are draining out into the bay. And, they're all very connected together. And I'm actually going to go to the next slide so you can see. Here's just a graphic of some of our Santa Clara County watersheds. And so you can see how the geographical areas of the watersheds are a little bit different depending on how they're defined by elevated ridge lines of the land and where the water is being funneled out. But even though we're in different watersheds, we're all super connected, and that also means that a lot of the actions that we have can, has a ripple effect throughout the rest of the watershed and the ecosystem, especially downstream from where we are. So let's get to the fish. So here we have a handful of some of the many, many local fish species that we have in our creeks. These are kind of the main players that we will be finding more often in in our different creeks of Santa Clara and San Mateo counties, not including introduced species, which might include green sunfish, western mosquito fish, bluegill, common carp, or even goldfish, focusing more in on like the native endemic species. But it also doesn't account for some extinct species as well, that may, be from competition with other organisms, or maybe some environmental changes that have prevented them from being able to have a sustained population nearby. So all of these different fish have unique life histories. They all take up different niches in the creek habitat. Some prefer to live up at different elevation levels. Some have certain preferences, but in general, they're all typically found in clear, cool creeks. They like protection, some, shady tree overhangs, ways to really protect themselves from predators, and hide out, look for things to eat. They're also temperature tolerant, and a lot of them are also tolerant to tidal estuarine habitats. So they are used to that tidal influence that we get from the San Francisco Bay, more in the downstream areas of these creeks. A few highlights in particular: we've got the Sacramento pike minnow, the California roach, and the Sacramento sucker that are all typically hang out in the same areas. You might look in a pool and they'll all be there, but maybe taking up different areas of that one space. And Pacific lampreys are also pretty unique because they like to also head out into the ocean as adults. Juveniles prefer gravel beds, and they like to forage at the bottom of the creek bed for algae and invertebrates and detritus, which is dead organic matter. And adults are a little bit more adventurous. They like to feed on diatoms, which is a type of algae, and detritus, or in addition to macroinvertebrates as well. And generally, sometimes they like to forage a bit more during the first few or last few hours of the day to keep themselves safe. In general, a lot of these fish undergo group spawning. So they're all choosing to spawn at the same time. That's something that's triggered by warmer temperatures. That's their sign that they have that, now's the time to reproduce. But in particular, our male riffle sculpins, which you can see in our bottom center photo, they like to guard the egg nests that might even have eggs from multiple females. So that's a couple cool facts there. And in particular, there is a Robert Leidy study that was conducted in this area that kind of shows the distribution and abundance of these different species of fish in our San Mateo and Santa Clara County watersheds. And in general, Coyote Creek, Guadalupe Creek of Santa Clara County, and San Mateo Creek of San Mateo County are the most fish diverse. But of course, you might be looking at this and wondering, like, so where are our salmonid species? Like, that's a really charismatic species that we want to know more about, right? So don't worry, we're getting to that now. We're going to spend a lot more time talking about them this evening. In the past, steelhead salmon, steelhead trout, Chinook salmon, and coho salmon were all once abundant in the Santa Clara, San Mateo, and San Mateo counties and their watersheds. They were a huge staple of the Ohlone diet and were super abundant. But a lot has changed since then. Coho salmon, which aren't pictured here, by the way, they are now locally extinct. They're not present in our local watersheds anymore. Steelhead trout populations in Northern and Central California, as well as the Central California Chinook populations, are all threatened under the Federal Endangered Species Act. And I also want to clarify that steelhead trout and rainbow trout are the same species, but they have different life histories. So the rainbow trout is an entirely freshwater fish, and steelhead trout do like to go into the ocean for parts of their life cycle. Generally, you can tell them apart because steelhead trout are a bit bigger, since they have that opportunity to go into the ocean and have more space and more resources to feed on. And another difference that you can find among fishes that might be from hatcheries or our wild stock is from the presence of their adipose fin, which is this fin that you see right here on the back. some hatcheries will choose to remove that fin. So that's another way you can kind of tell them apart. A lot of, in addition to that, a lot of the hatchery fish will have a tag on their, like in the front of their nose, like their nasal cavity, but that's a harder thing to see, obviously, since it's embedded. So, you know, like I said earlier, the fish that we're primarily seeing here are a combination of hatchery fish and some wild stock. It's kind of hard to state accurately which watersheds currently have salmonid species. There's a variety of different studies from different times. Not a ton of fish work is happening on like our side of the Santa Cruz Mountains within the South San Francisco Bay watersheds. But we do have some research that shows that they definitely have some more recent history of being in certain watersheds. So for the steelhead trout or rainbow trout populations, they've been found in Coyote Creek, Guadalupe Creek, San Tomas Aquino, Saratoga Creek, Stevens Creek, San Francisquito Creek, and San Mateo. And Chinook salmon have been found in Coyote Creek. And more recently, an exciting thing is that the South Bay Clean Creeks Coalition has recently been doing some Chinook salmon monitoring work the last few years, and they've been able to really see those salmon coming in to spawn the last few years. So that's like, you know, hardcore recent proof that they're definitely present over there. But regardless of these different studies, these populations are definitely not nearly as abundant as they used to be. So that's goes to show that we definitely need to do what we can to help protect these species, because they're really offering a lot to our ecosystem, and we want to keep them around. And with that, I'm going to pass the mic over to Siena, who's going to share a little bit more about our the life cycles of our local salmonid species.
So now that we learned about our local salmonid species, we're going to go over their life cycle. So just to clarify, salmonids include salmon species and steelhead trout. So this life cycle applies to steelhead trout that are still living in our local creeks. And salmonids are grouped together by their anadromous life cycle. So that means they're born in a creek, and then they migrate to the ocean to mature and feed on the food that's abundant in the ocean. And then they migrate back to the creek where they spawn and then die. So we'll start with the eggs. So the eggs are laid in the gravel in a redd, which is their nest, by a female and fertilized by the male. And they'll stay in the gravel until they hatch into tiny little alevin. And alevin are tiny baby fish with a little yolk sac, and that feeds them until they are ready to emerge from the gravel and then become juvenile salmon. And once they're juveniles, they can move around in the creek, and they'll look for zooplankton and macroinvertebrates to feed on. And steelhead specifically can spend up to 7 years in freshwater before they would start migrating to the ocean, but generally they spend about 2 to 3 years. And those that don't end up migrating to the ocean are rainbow trout. But once they start migrating, they'll reach the estuary, and that's where they become smolt. And they become smolt through the process of smoltification, which is where they go through physiological changes to their gills and kidneys and other organs so that they can maintain their body chemistry in salt water. And then once they become smolt, and they'll feed in the estuary for several months, and then they can enter the ocean as adults, and they'll have counter shading where they have dark on their back and light on their belly to blend in with their environment to predators, so predators can't feed on them. And then once they're in the ocean, they'll have lots of prey. They usually spend a few months to 3 years at sea for steelhead, but generally 2 to 3 years. And then once they are ready to spawn, they'll develop sexual characteristics. So you can tell the males and females apart. And the male will usually have a hooked nose called a keel. So once they return to the stream to spawn, the female will make a red with her tail, lay the eggs, and the male will fertilize them. And steelhead specifically usually have winter and summer runs, and they can return multiple times to spawn, but many of them do die after their first time of spawning. So now that we know a little bit about their life cycle, they have specific habitat requirements at each stage of this life cycle since they do move through so many environments. So we'll start with the eggs. They obviously need some gravel because that protects them from predators, and good flow through that gravel to bring oxygen and cooler temperatures. And they also need low turbidity. So turbidity is a measurement of how much sediment is in the water. So you want low turbidity so that these eggs that are not mobile won't be covered with sediment when there's lots of sediment flowing through the water. And then for the fry, when they're juveniles, they need to be looking for macroinvertebrates. So pools and riffles are great in the creek. Riffles are where the macroinvertebrates like to live, and then pools are good spaces for those fry to hang out in and wait for macroinvertebrates to either move by them or for foraging for them. And then they also need roots and vegetation from plants to hide from predators. And they'll also need the macroinvertebrates, so they need like detritus and other things that will feed those macroinvertebrates. So the smolt, once they become smolt, they'll need access to that estuary so they can go through their process of smoltification. And then they'll also need some roots and vegetation, just like the fry, to hide from predators, and more macroinvertebrates to feed themselves as they move toward the ocean. And as spawners, when they come back to their stream, they need to have a path free of barriers. And they'll also need pools and gravel where they can lay their eggs that will have good flow to keep them free of sediment. So salmonids, including steelhead, have a really important role in our ecosystems. So they, as a salmonid, they eat macroinvertebrates like the caddis fly at the top left and this stonefly on the bottom left. They're also a really important food source at all stages of their life, whether they're a fry or a big adult salmon. There's a picture of the sea otter, or actually a river otter, I think, here eating a salmonid fish head, and then a heron at the bottom with a smaller salmon. They're also a super important nutrient source. So once they die after spawning, their body will decompose and provide nutrients to the aquatic invertebrates that are within the creek, but also to the trees and surrounding vegetation. In good fish run years, trees actually have bigger growth rings, and those same trees on creeks without the salmon will grow at a third of the rate of the trees that do have that salmon in their creeks. So these are a really important food source for both animals and for the trees. So because they are such an important fish in our ecosystems, we want to protect them, but there are a lot of threats to the fish, especially within our local creeks. So urbanization is a big impact on our creeks. We've really modified the area surrounding our creeks and the creek itself. So in this picture, you can see San Francisquito Creek running through the center diagonally. There's a big green strip, but it definitely has been encroached on by our roads and our housing. And all of these impervious surfaces that don't absorb the water, all of that space is our watershed, and it all flows into our local creek. So anything that's covering these spaces, like pollutants that we might have spilled on the roads, this all goes straight to our creek. And it also increases how much water is going into our creek since it's not being absorbed by the land. And it creates faster velocities within our creek and more erosion. So I have a few examples of local modification of creeks. So we'll start with the top left, that is Searsville Dam. And this dam is a really big barrier to steelhead trout. So they are not able to cross this dam and access higher spawning grounds that might be more pristine. And it is also a trap for sediment and gravel that might be making its way down into our estuaries and into the creek that would provide important gravel for the steelhead to spawn in. And then we also have San Francisquito Creek on the bottom left. This is closer to the bay and is more modified than some other areas of San Francisquito. But we have some sackcrete on the left and then some concrete on the right. And as you can see, there's very limited vegetation, not a lot of trees, not a lot of shade, and not much gravel. It's mostly fine silts that wouldn't be good spawning habitat for salmon. We also have Permanente Creek Diversion Channel on the right, which is just a box channel of concrete. There's no vegetation, no gravel. So this would be pretty poor habitat for salmon. Because there is no vegetation, there's no shade, there's no hiding spaces for salmon, and you also lose the dropped vegetation like leaves and other vegetation that would decompose and provide food for macroinvertebrates that the fish need. So those are just some examples of local modification. But we also have another threat from urban areas, which is urban runoff and non-point source pollution. So non-point source pollution is anything that's coming from our local communities and you can't point to any one individual or company that's spilling into our creeks. So it could be anything from car oil to soapy water to fertilizers. So all of these have detrimental effects on our salmon. So we have car oil that's very toxic to aquatic invertebrates and also salmon. And then soapy water is not good for salmon because the salmon are covered in, or salmonids are covered in a mucousy layer, and that helps protect them from bacteria and other scrapes or anything. If they go over a rock in the creek, they won't get scraped because they have this mucus that protects it from them. And when we add soapy water to our creeks, that can dissolve that mucousy layer that's protective, and it can expose them to infection and other injuries. We also have pet waste, pesticides, herbicides like this Roundup, and fertilizers. And all of these can add toxic chemicals and excess nutrients. And when we add excess nutrients into our water, that can create really big algal blooms that then use up all those nutrients. And once there's no more nutrients left, they'll die off. And then bacteria will come in, decompose those, and use up all the oxygen in the water. And that's bad for our aquatic invertebrates and fish because then they won't have any oxygen to breathe in the water. And then trash is also can be an obstacle, such as shopping carts in the water. And they can also be consumed by fish and block their digestive system and replace the space that food could be taking up. So those are just a few urban threats to fish. But there are many ways that we can help fix these urban threats, which will be talked about by Clara. She's going to talk about what we do at Grassroots Ecology.
All right, so my name is Clara, and I am an ecologist also with Grassroots Ecology. I've been with Grassroots Ecology, or its predecessor organization, for almost 14 years, amazingly. And I'm going to be sharing more about what we can do to make sure that the salmonid and other living things have what they need in our creeks. What we're doing is Grassroots Ecology, and then what members of the public can do as well. So just to start out explaining why we have funding for our creeks, a lot of it comes because of the economic value of anadromous fish. So we ought to be doing more to understand the value of nature's services to us. But so far it's taken things like anglers wanting to be able to fish, lobbying their politicians, and the fact that people want to be able to put salmon on their plates, that we have more concern about these species that are more fun to fish and more fun to eat than a stickleback, say, although I think they're particularly wonderful little fish. So these species bring in the funding, and wonderful people like Haley and Siena to work with us. So we're glad about that. But everything we do for them is also benefiting everybody else because we're all connected. And so I just wanted to highlight some of my other favorite riparian species. I love frogs, and this is one we saw more of in the olden times and still have in our upper watersheds. It's the red-legged frog, the one from Mark Twain's Calaveras County jumping frog contest. Now they use bullfrogs, sadly, because they have taken over a lot of the watersheds where the red-legged frogs live. My favorite riparian bird is the kingfisher, and we have those along our creek. Sometimes you hear them rattling through. And then there's lovely riparian vegetation, and this is a little the little seeds forming on a box elder tree hanging over Stevens Creek. That's a picture I took. So here are all the sites that we're working at Grassroots Ecology. So it extends from southern San Mateo County into Santa Clara. Our farthest south is Hendry's Creek right now in the Los Gatos watershed. But I want to talk a little bit, I want to go a little bit from north to south and talk about a few of our sites. When I first lived on the peninsula, I lived in a house on a small tributary to Arroyo Ojo de Agua up here. That's the creek that runs through Stolsaf Park, where we've been working for a long time and where Joan and Craig have supported our work with children. Their kids went to Kennedy Middle School that's right by the park there. But the interesting thing that I learned was that our neighbors who own their property were wanting to tear down and rebuild their house, but they were not allowed to do that without putting their creek, either getting a variance to do that, to not do this, or put their creek underground in a pipe. That was called a creek improvement. So that was, gosh, I hate to say it, but almost 30 years ago now. And the times have changed. So we're seeing our creeks more as an asset than a problem. So I'm sure Redwood City is no longer requiring people to bury their creeks when they want to rebuild on their houses. The next big watershed down, we have San Francisquito Creek, where we've worked for many years. And that is an interesting creek because it's got multiple jurisdictions on either side. It's the boundary between San Mateo and Santa Clara County. And so having two counties and multiple cities, there was challenge to come to a consensus about who was going to pay for what for channelizing the creek. So fortunately, that's part of what's kept it from being channelized when all the other creeks were. And now we have a joint powers authority that's getting a lot of input from neighbors and from environmental organizations as to how flood control projects should happen. Unfortunately, we had some major flooding in the bottom, so there is some hardscaping like flood walls going in along the bottom of the creek. And then I like to remember the next three creeks as the Mba Creeks. It's just a good little mnemonic for remembering what order they come in: Matadero and Barron and Adobe Creek. The top of Matadero Creek, we have a Rastadaro as a tributary, and that's where one of our flagship programs, the Rastadaro Preserve project is. And I will be talking about a cool thing we did watershed-wise up there. And then Adobe Creek, where we have Redwood Grove. And if you've been up at Hidden Villa, the Duvedex were very intelligent people. They bought the whole watershed because they realized they're going to be drinking that water. They wanted to control all of the land that drained into it. They have since donated some of that land to Mid-Peninsula Open Space District, but they originally owned the entire upper watershed. And then Stevens and Permanente Creek we've been working on for a long time. Well, it was first, I first worked with the Stevens and Permanente Creek Watershed Council, helping them start a volunteer monitoring program probably about 20 years ago now. So they've been working down, volunteers have been involved in monitoring that creek for a very long time. So what can we do to protect these precious watersheds? Well, one of them is, as I was saying, making sure that people change this perception. Bullet number 3 is change the perception of a creek as a problem to a creek as an asset. Unfortunately, that's happening. You can see the Guadalupe River down in San Jose is being celebrated instead of just put behind a chain link fence. Then creating stream buffers, so we have room for the riparian vegetation and room for the creek to move a little bit from side to side. And then when we do have a lot of roads and roofs, making sure that we do what we can to disconnect all that hardscaping from the storm drains. So there's a lot of what we're calling now green stormwater infrastructure projects to get the runoff from hard surfaces to soak into the ground. And one of the ways we can get people to change their perception about creeks is to make them realize that property values in areas with natural stream channels generally have higher property values. So that's a benefit to the people who own the land. All right, so disconnecting impervious surfaces. It's a pretty interesting thing we can be doing. And there's large scale projects that would take, whole sections of street storm drains and put them into either underground cisterns or flood a soccer field seasonally or something like that. And those have a lot of potential to do a lot to help stream flooding all at one go. But I believe that there's a lot we can do by a whole lot of people making a little bit of difference. And so we have a grant from what we did. We've used it now, and hopefully we'll find some more to do some demonstration projects of how to slow spread and sink your rainwater. So the top picture here on the left side is a rain tank. I think it's 265 gallon Bushman slimline tank, and it takes the roof runoff from, I think they call it the carriage house at Gamble Garden, and it stores it in this tank. And then between storm events, they can run the water. There's a valve that runs it so they can water vegetation with it. But it has another split that comes through this fence. And we created a rain garden in an area that they had mostly non-native plants and not a lot of interesting aesthetics. So we dug out a stream channel there and put in gravel and some river rock and planted plants along the side of it. So you can turn the valve on this rain tank, and then, as you can see in this little video, the water comes running through, so you have an active little stream while the water is coming out. So it's good to empty the tank between rain events so that you're capturing the next rain event. So if you don't need it for irrigation, that's a good way to get the water into the ground, and then we have it for later use as groundwater, because we still do have wells around the peninsula for water resources. And then this is my driveway in Palo Alto, where we've got, you can see just a little bit farther back there, the white pipe leads to a wine barrel. And we've got 2 of those at the Peninsula Conservation Center where our building offices are. And you can go take a look at those. We also have some instruction sheets we put together that we're going to get up on our website, so people who want to buy a wine barrel from one of the local wineries and start capturing water that way. I really love having it because it's so easy to just but we get long stretches with no rain, and then all of a sudden we get a rain. Like, in fact, they're saying maybe we'll have rain on Monday. So that would be lovely if I could catch another round of water to use for some of my plantings. And then this driveway used to be solid concrete, so very impervious. We won't do it again now, especially at our age. But about 15 years ago, my husband and I and one day laborer took a hammer and digging bar, and we broke up the old driveway, moved it all to the side, put in gravel and sand, and then laid the pieces back and put DG between them. And so when the rain hits this, it soaks in and it doesn't go running off into the street and carry pollutants with it. So that's the groundwater, the Greening Urban Watersheds project. Now, we've been also doing for many years different kinds of citizen science projects, and the importance of these is finding out if we have issues to deal with in our creeks and then helping figure out what to do about them. But you can test the water directly in water quality monitoring. We don't have a lot of budget for that, so we tend to test pretty simple things like dissolved oxygen, temperature, turbidity, pH. But you can learn a lot by looking at the critters that are living in a creek, because for one thing, if there aren't any, you've got a pretty good indicator that there's some toxicity going on. But you can also tell by the type of critters what the health of the creek is, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. We bring our samples back in, and this is our, we get to use the old nature museum at McClellan Ranch for a bug club. Here's Shelley, who you've heard talking here, and and talking about piscivorous, or writing about piscivorous fish. Shelley and Sarah are our two entomologists that are helping or keep that bug club going. I started it as a Stevens and Permanente Creek Watershed employee with Jim Carter and Steve Fenn from the USGS, because they were very interested in Stevens Creek and the sediments that came down it and how the dam altered the sediment movement. So we'll talk a little bit about that too, but actually we'll talk about it a little bit right now, because the next slide I wanted to I just chose one water quality parameter, which Siena's already mentioned, and that's turbidity. So turbidity is how murky the water is. And we measure it with something called a nephelometric turbidity meter, which means it's taking a light reading. So it sends light through the sample, and it tells us how much light comes out the other side. So if there's not a light, if you see this really murky sample on the right, not a lot of light's going to pass through. So it gives you a reading. So the very first slide is a creek that would look clear, like the far left. The very last slide is a creek that's very murky, that would look like the beaker on the far right. Now, these are the same area of Stevens Creek up above the dam. Now, erosion happens, and some of it's just natural because we live in the kind of geology which is very erosive. It can bring trees in, which what we've heard from both Siena and Shelley is not a bad thing, because we need large woody debris to form pools, but it also brings a lot of dirt into the creek. But that dirt moves on through the watershed and goes out to the bay. And now we're realizing our bay is sediment starved. We don't have enough sediments down there, and that's going to be a problem with global climate issues and sea level rise, because we need more sediments to build up the bayland, so we still have some left as the water continues to rise. So I went up on a day where we had a big rain. The water looked like this, chocolate brown, one of the highest turbidities I've ever measured. I came back in a few hours and it was back to looking like this. Now, on the other hand, below the dam on Stevens Creek, you can see that's what the middle picture is. And it's kind of like the middle beaker. The water's always kind of turbid. And the reason that is that the dam is capturing, sadly, it's capturing the gravels that we need. See all the gravels on the bottom of the creek? We don't have as much gravel on the bottom of the creek below the dam because it's being held back by the dam. Also, if there are gravels, the light sediment is able to come over the top of the dam. A lot of it stays kind of in suspension, which makes it hard for the fish to find their food and for the little elven to breathe down there in the gravel. But it also, it fills in the spaces between the gravel. So that's called embeddedness. It's something we sometimes measure when we do assessments of creeks. So San Francisquito Creek also has a dam on it, but it's not got the same level of problem. And the reason that is that there's a Bear Creek watershed that comes in just below the dam. I don't know, maybe a half mile below the dam. If you've gone for a walk at Jasper Ridge, you might have seen where that comes in. And so if you have an unimpeded watershed, those flushing flows wash the sediments out. So there's been talk about trying to let flushing flows go down Stevens Creek. They do that in some watersheds in Australia where they just purposely let big flows go through. The problem is we've got so many expensive homes on the banks. You got to be really careful that you don't have a flushing flow that also floods somebody's property. All right, so we talked briefly about our critters and how we use them to see how healthy the creek is. So there's some really interesting things that live down there in the water. Most of them are the immature forms of terrestrial insects. So we have different levels of sensitivity that have been determined for the different critters. So you can tell a little bit about the watershed health based on what is your suite of organisms. So if you see things that mainly look like this across the top with a lot of mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies, we give it a high EPT index for Ephemeroptera, Plecoptera, and Trichoptera. And that means it's pretty good streams. So above the dam, you see a lot of these critters, including this beautiful stonefly here. Then in the middle, this is sort of the so-so area, as we call it, and it's got you know, critters that can move around a lot and find new spots, or they have tubes to breathe through, or more gills, or somehow adapted so they can deal with a little bit lower oxygen and more sediment. There's even one of the caddisflies here, so not all of caddisflies are sensitive. This one is a cool looking one. I got bit by one of them once, so I don't like them as much as I used to, but it made me look at it and go, gosh, you could bite me. Maybe I could turn you into, skewer you and put you on my grill. It almost looks like a little shrimp or something. Whoops. And then the last ones are, these are black fly larvae, and these are all things that can live in more still water or less oxygen. So if you're interested in these guys and you want to learn more, someday we're going to be able to go back to Bug Club and need people to help collect samples and figure out who's who in our samples. So if you don't have a lab or a microscope to check out the water quality, you can still see that there are water quality problems when there's been some kind of a spill, or there's a couple of events that happened on Rastadaro Creek in Palo Alto. One of them was a wheelchair disinfectant that the VA hospital was using, that they washed them off, apparently used it concentrated enough that when it got into the creek and went down through Bowl Park, it killed a lot of the organisms in the creek. Fortunately, the city was able to trace it back, and now they have to do their wheelchair cleaning somewhere where the water could be captured and sent to the sanitary sewer for treatment. There was also a construction project where they were putting a coating on a roof that metacrylic, it's a white coating, and it's supposed to have a few days before rain to dry out. Well, it rained the next day and that all got washed through the creek. So keeping your eye out on the creek, you can see issues that come up and then let your city know, or let us know, and we can talk to the right people. But you can also see people doing things that, you know, hopefully don't match the letter of the law. It depends on your community what your stream buffer requirements are. This is a house on Adobe Creek. So Adobe Creek is right here. Hiddenville is just up the road. And this retaining wall is just going to cause erosion problems for somebody else on the other side. It's also going to speed up the process of the water running through, so it's not going to be as healthy of an ecosystem for the critters that live in the creek there, including trout. All right, now we have people who back in the olden days, and hopefully this isn't happening anymore, just totally bury a creek. So this is a Rastadaro Preserve, which, you know, for thousands of years was managed by the indigenous people here, who didn't have a huge impact on the watershed. They would put, you know, some buckeye or things like buckeye that would stun the fish so that they could catch them and eat them, but nothing that had a long lasting effect. But this horse ranch, they wanted more room for their riding arenas. And so they put the creek that used to go through here into a pipe underground. So in 1991, this picture was taken from the air, and you can see that the city has now acquired the land around it for a park. So this is the Rastadaro Preserve parking lot. And this is what was called the Bressler property. It was a horse ranch. And there was a creek that flowed through it. In fact, see this, if you can see my arrow, that little lone plum tree is there because there was a hole in the culvert. So water was flowing through, but there's no water, you know, in the creek because it's underground, so no vegetation was growing there. But in earlier in 2000, the city was able to, the Peninsula Open Space Trust helped the city to purchase this piece of land from the Bresser family. And then they got a grant from the Coastal Conservancy to dig out the culvert. And I'll show you a picture of what that looked like, and put it back into a natural stream channel. And then we were contracted, actually one of my very first work days with, it was Actera Stewardship then, same group of people though. We started the vegetation in December of 2006 on this stretch of creek. And this is what it looked like 2 years ago. It's very similar today with lots and lots of vegetation, lots of diversity, and lots of life, which I'll show you at least one picture here. So here's the steps. They removed the pipe, They reshaped the creek as best as they could. If they'd had a little more knowledge of the historical stream flow, they could have probably done a little better. There's some rocky areas that probably where the stream was that were kind of hard for us to plant in, but they did a really good job. So they put in a sinuous pattern that slows the creek down. It helps it make, I was thinking about it because I love to ski and I haven't done it in years. It's kind of like, you know, instead of being a downhill skier that goes straight, you know, you put on your telemark skis and you cut some curves. And when you do that, just like when you're skiing and you push the snow up on the banks, you get these deeper spots of pools, and then you get these straight stretches where you go faster. Those are the riffles, and then you have a pool, and then you have a riffle. So it's a pool riffle sequence that makes it a natural stream channel. And not only that, but I don't know if you can see these little stakes in here. These are willow stakes. Willows have a hormone that just allows them to grow when you just cut a piece of them off and stick them. You got to stick them right side up so the roots are down and the top, the leaves go up. But they are holding in logs, so some of that large woody debris in several spots down this creek. The logs cut across so that we get some pools and formation. And then we started vegetating, and here's one of our youngest little planting participants being carefully watched with that dangerous tool. But when we were all done with it, we had a lot of wildlife move in. We've seen all of these critters that I listed here on the side. Well, the mountain lion, I don't know that anybody's actually seen the mountain lion there. There was a camera trap of a mountain lion at Rastadaro. I was hoping to hear from Melissa whether that was in Mayfly Creek area. Oh, speaking of which, we called it Mayfly Creek because the first thing that came to live here were the mayflies, and it didn't have a name. Plus, the creek is ephemeral, and mayflies are in the Ephemeroptera because they only live a short time. So there's two reasons for that to be Mayfly Creek. But the mountain lions we know were there because there was evidence in a deer kill that it had been killed by mountain lion in this stretch of creek where there had been nothing but horse arena. All right, so daylighting is one cool thing you can do, and revegetating, and then there are other fish passage barriers that come in the form of a weir or some other, like I said, the diversion channel for Lake Lagunita was a little dam. This was to protect, this is El Palo Alto Park. This is the pedestrian bridge, and this is the train bridge over San Francisquito Creek. And this wall here is to support the creek, the bridges, and make sure that they don't get washed out. Well, it's easy to get erosion under the bottom of a concrete structure like this. So the purpose of the weir was to protect it so it wouldn't get washed out. But that was back in a time when they didn't know that there were other ways to do that. So EPA got funding, and the San Mateo Resource Conservation District managed the project, and they contracted with us to help with the revegetation. But before we came in, they had big bulldozers come in and put boulders in underneath here and bring in a lot of cobble. And so now there's no longer a fish passage issue through that area. These are girls from Hillview School. They're hammering in willow stakes. Here's a willow stake that started to sprout. And then here's a picture of the willows growing on either side of the bank. They've gotten a lot bigger since then, but that was the one I could find. So the willows are going to do a lot to provide habitat as well as prevent erosion. They apparently also are don't do a lot. In fact, they might actually help with water flow. So there's a lot of vegetation removal that takes place in the name of flood control to get the water to move through faster. But willow gives it a little bit of roughness, which apparently kind of acts like the reason they put little dimples in a golf ball, because that prevents some eddying or something that happens fluid mechanically that slows down the airflow. So apparently willows could actually help the water move faster through if you have them along the banks. That was, some hydrogeomorphologists shared that with me, and I thought it was pretty cool. So here's another really fun project that Junko Bryant, who's been on our staff for many years, she got funding and contracted with Daniel McCormick and Mary O'Brien to help produce this art project, which is also very functional, to take willows. I'll show you in a later picture. This used to be all Arundo Donax, or giant reed. So we had volunteers help us cut it out. We had these tarps over it to help kill it. And then when we took the tarp away, it was clear that this area was going to be subject to erosion, especially on an outside bend like that. So Daniel and Mary came in and worked with lots of volunteers, and we made willow fascines, bundles of willow that we put in through here, and then they wove this beautiful project of willow and other poplars and other plants over the top, and you can see it started to take to leaf here and grow. We had a major storm, fortunately too soon after, I think, the installation, so some of it got a little washed out. If people have questions about it, I saw Junko's name on there. She might have gone off to help her children with homework, but yeah, if you have more questions, we'll have time to talk about it later. And then just general revegetating projects along the creek. Here's the arundo I mentioned. That's where that willow weaving project is. And then this is the other side of the creek farther down, where I recently went for a bike ride and found this beautiful cow parsnip and 9 bark, and there were like 6 or 8 different native plants just in this one picture that used to be all in an area where there was blackberry and ivy and not much else growing. So revegetation is a really good thing for the ecosystem for fish and other things. So we're going to wrap up here, summarize. I hope I haven't gone seriously over, but want to talk about what people can do as individuals. And one of them is to join us and other people like Keep Coyote Creek Beautiful, South Bay Clean Creeks Coalition, Audubon, who hold different kinds of, community science education and hands-on work events like restoration and trash cleanups. Then a lot of the trash that we end up picking up comes because there's homeless encampments along the creek. So supporting affordable housing, so we have fewer homeless encampments, is something else you can do. Then also be more involved in your city's flood protection and development plans. Oops, I forgot to put the asterisks down here, but this was to refer you down to this document, and you'll get these slides later. If you want to look this up, you could just Google it, and it's the Valley Water put this out several years ago, but it's a very good set of guidelines for what kind of stream buffers you need and how to develop in a way that protects our streams' ecosystem function. And then all the things you can do around your house. If you have a house and have the capability to make some changes to the landscaping and planting more natives that support the wildlife and putting in rainwater catchment or a garden, not using pesticides, the things that Siena was talking about. As she mentioned, soap is very bad for fish, even biodegradable soap, because it doesn't have time to biodegrade unless you wash your car on gravel or on a lawn or something like that, so the water can go into the soil and biodegrade, or you take it to a car wash and they send that water off to the sewage treatment plant to biodegrade. And if you still want to use, if you're doing it, you want to use biodegradable soaps, because the non-biodegradable ones often have estrogen mimickers, which are not good for the fish in the bay. And then driving less, because it's not just the oil and grease that comes off a car, but tire wear and brake pad dust. Brake pad dust is the biggest contribution of copper that's toxic to aquatic life. So every time, I mean, the last few weeks, we've all been pretty good about leaving our cars put. So maybe we'll get in a habit of doing less climbing in our car. Lastly, I just want to share, to get to know your local creek, Hannah shared a link to the Oakland Museum maps, and you got to click around a lot to figure out exactly which map is the one you should be on for your neighborhood. But most of the peninsula is there, and I just picked a section of where I talked about Arroyo Ojo de Agua, the house I lived in, where they were going to make them improve the creek, was here in this area, a little tributary to Arroyo Ojo de Agua, which is a tributary to Redwood Creek. But it was hard looking at this to remember exactly where our house was, because a lot of the streets aren't labeled. So what I like to do when I pull up the Oakland Museum map is have Google Maps or Google Earth open at the same time, because you can see things like Woodside Road, you can see Sequoia Hospital is somewhere in this corner, at least I saw it when I was copying this picture. So you can find little landmarks and then line things up and figure out where you are. So this is all one watershed. It's all one color. The pink is all the Redwood Creek watershed. But if you want to see your little sub-watershed, if you're in, you know, Arroyo Ojo de Agua, or if you're in the main tributary, then you have to look at the topo lines and see where the ridges are and follow it. So that's the extent of what I wanted to share.